first of all,
Good
is
morning,
this a
Lauren.
good sign? Queensland has been really reluctant to learn to live with COVID. Now Anastasia Palaszczuk is opening the border 4 days earlier. This is with Omicron, with a lot of unknowns at the moment. But does this finally give you hope that Australia might get back together?
It is a positive sign. I mean, Queensland has almost reached, and this is why they are opening 80% double vaccinated, which was always the professional medical advice and the modelling advice from the Doherty Institute and others, that once you reach that level of community vaccination, you can open up safely. And I think it's really good that Queensland's doing this. I think it means the eastern states, at least, New South Wales, Victoria and Queensland, which together are about 3/4 of the national economy, are moving in the same direction and learning to do what we said we've always needed to do, which is begin to treat COVID-19 like any other infectious disease and normalise its existence as part of our everyday life.
Well, the Prime Minister has put a pause on some 200,000 students and migrant workers, skilled workers, on coming here. That is set to expire. Or was it meant to be a 2-week pause? Would you urge him to maintain that time frame?
Look, I would, but subject to what we know about Omicron, and look, we should get the data on that relatively soon because they're doing the studies now in South Africa. What we need to understand, obviously, is the Omicron variant any more dangerous than the other variants? That is does it cause higher mortality rates? And is the vaccination still effective against Omicron? Now, provided the vaccination is still effective and provided the Omicron variant is no more dangerous, well, then I don't see any reason why we should delay opening up further. But I think it's important that we get that data and that evidence first before making those decisions.
Yeah. How desperate are those in your electorate for these workers to come in?
Look, there's honestly the biggest challenge facing small businesses in my electorate, and I speak to them all the time and visit them all the time, is staff and workforce shortages. Whether you're a restaurant, whether you're a coffee shop, whether you're a childcare centre, whether you're a hairdresser or a barber, even florists, all these people have relied very much upon students, working holiday makers, backpackers to fill these positions in their workforce, and they're just not here right now. So, everyone knows this, but there's shops that can't open as much as they would like. There's businesses that can't trade. There's lots of waiting at restaurants and things like that. I think this is probably the biggest supply side constraint on the economy right now. It's workforce shortages.
Yeah, indeed. Let me ask you about China and what the US has done overnight. You're a former diplomat. You know how these things work. The US is called a diplomatic boycott on the Winter Games in China. What does that actually mean and what effect will it have?
Well, look, it does mean that the United States, at an official level, is not going to be participating or attending the games. That means at the government-to-government level, as I understand it, athletes will still be able to participate and compete and whatnot. But it is quite a strong diplomatic signal. The last time we had a boycott of any significance, of course, was the 1980 Moscow Olympics and then the 1984 Los Angeles Olympics, when we were on two sides of the Cold War there. And the Western Allies boycotted Moscow and the Soviets and their allies boycotted Los Angeles. So it is quite a significant step, and it's obviously informed by concerns over China's human rights records, its actions in places like Hong Kong, its aggressions towards Taiwan and across the Taiwan Strait and elsewhere. So it will obviously cause a number of countries, including our own, to assess our own position.
What do you think we should do?
Well, look, I'm not a fan of athletes boycotting Olympics because I tend not to like sport and politics to mix, but I can see sometimes that's almost inevitable. But I'm also conscious, look, the Olympics is a big exercise in transparency. You have a whole lot of media that come into your country that follow the games, of course, but they're also interested in talking to people and the human interest story and covering politics and whatnot. So generally speaking, it's been a great driver of liberalisation. I mean, when Barcelona hosted the Olympics in 1992, Spain had only just returned as a democracy, if you like, from military dictatorship not long before this was their coming out. When Seoul hosted the Olympics in 1988, it helped herald the end of the military dictatorship there. I'm not suggesting Beijing is going to do the same, but generally speaking, I think it can be a force for good, and I like to encourage participation in those things.
Yeah, I mean, you say sport and politics don't mix, but the Olympic Games has got to be the exception of that. There's so much politics around it all the time. But so you're suggesting perhaps Australia should consider a diplomatic boycott, but not go as far as boycott our athletes?
I wouldn't like to see our athletes miss out on the opportunities. And the truth is, there's any number of countries that have hosted the Olympics with pretty checkered human rights records, and we haven't asked athletes to boycott those in the past. Official level representation. Look, I would actually welcome more official level contact with China, and if we can get that by attending the Olympics, I think that's an opportunity we should take. But look, the United States has also made this decision. Doesn't mean we should reflexively follow them, but we certainly need to take it into consideration.
Okay, let's talk climate. Would you say that this is the number one issue for voters in your electorate at the next election?
No, I wouldn't. I think it's one of a number of very important issues, but the things that people in my electorate care about are things like, our emergence from COVID-19, the availability of booster shots, the emergence of new variants, getting our borders open again, and that's obviously been the overwhelming concern over the past 12 to 18 months is managing COVID-19 and the pandemic. The businesses are very concerned about the state of the national economy, addressing things like workforce shortages, which I discussed earlier, but getting the borders open and allowing trade to resume again as well. And then national security. I mean, I think people here know that we live in a more uncertain and more unstable world, and Australia is less able to rely upon some of the traditional guarantees which safeguarded our security and our prosperity for most of the past 70 years. So that's an important issue as well. Climate change, absolutely, but I don't think any voter is, or very few voters at least, single issue voters. They need to weigh all these sorts of things. And ultimately it's about which party do you want to form government and which person do you want sitting in the lodge leading the country.
Well, you did say that a 45% emissions reduction by 2030 was achievable and the right way to go. What was it like standing next to the Prime Minister yesterday telling you you were wrong?
Well, I said actually by 2035, Laura, and we haven't actually made a commitment. That was that's the next commitment period, if you like, under the Paris Agreement. The next target we need to inscribe is for 2035. We don't need to do that yet. We need to do it around 2025. That's when the Paris Agreement compels us to do so. And I'll continue to make the case. But I think 40 to 45% by 2035 is doable, and we'll see how the trajectory goes for the next few years. But, I'm part of the party. I don't always get my own way, but it's part of being a team that you argue your voice and you make your case, and you ultimately respect the team's decision. So I do that in this instance, but I'll certainly keep pushing for higher ambition in addressing climate change.
So you'd agree with Labor's ambition then?
No, I don't.
Why not?
As I said,
43% by 2030?
43% by 2030. Look, I think, if this descends into a competition about targets, I think it's going to be a disservice to the Australian people. We're all moving in the same direction. The commitment to net zero by 2050 is now a shared commitment. It's now a bipartisan commitment. And I think the debate should really be about, one, meeting our targets, because Australia, on that score, has a much better record than most of the Western world, indeed most of the world altogether. But also the tools we use to meet those targets. Are they going to be ones that are technology? Yeah, are they going to be harnessing all the innovation and ingenuity of the private sector? How are we going to get there? And that's as important as anything.
Haven't we seen that in Labor's modelling and plans that they released on Friday? I mean, how are you different from the Labor Party and what the Labor Party is calling for in this sense?
Well, I think we'll always adopt a more responsible approach towards tackling climate change, one that is takes account of the fact that we remain a fossil fuel intensive country, that a huge amount of our export earnings still comes from minerals mining and fossil fuels sector, and that we need to be careful in making that transition. I mean, unlike the Labor Party, we've actually got representatives in mining communities, in rural communities, in resource states of Queensland and Western Australia, which means we're going to do a better job of looking after those communities during this inevitable transition. Labor doesn't represent those communities. They don't have people even elected from those communities. And I think that's the big difference here.
But you don't represent that kind of community either. You're in the eastern suburbs of Sydney, and isn't this the biggest problem, that your party is going to have to speak to your constituents and those in the bush at the same time, and it seems they want different things?
Well, I think that's a challenge for any major political party. I mean, you need to speak to the whole country, and you need to address the whole country's concerns, and you need to accept and appreciate, as I do and as my Nationals colleagues do, that the perspective from where they sit might not be the perspective from where other parts of the party sit. But ultimately, this is how you have to govern a country. We're a single entity. We're a single national entity. We're not 151 sovereign states that all exist together in the national parliament, which means we need to look at the interests across the country and make the decision about what's the best way forward, being mindful of all those interests. And my view is Australia is much better governed as a result of that. I don't want an Australia that's got 151 sovereigns sitting in a parliament all arguing about any number of different things. The two-party system, in my view, has served Australia very well.
Speaking of perspective, just before I let you go, George Christensen has gone on Alex Jones's online show in the United States. Now, he's a far-right conspiracy theorist. He's used that platform, George Christensen, to go and urge people to protest at Australian embassies. What do you make of that?
Well, I condemn it absolutely. I think it's highly irresponsible. It's unnecessary. It's attention-seeking. I don't know the particular platform in the US. I don't know some of the circles in which these people watch these things. But look, I've just got no time for this sort of fringe stuff. I really don't think most of Australia's interested in it, and I think it does us all a disservice.
Dave Sharma, thanks so much for your time as always.
Thank you, Laura.